Thank you for joining Envirochat, Perkin-Elmer's series of one-on-one conversations with leaders in environmental analysis and sustainability. Episode 4, Regulating Microplastics, Mitigating Macro Risks. The term microplastics was introduced in 2004 and refers to any type of plastic fragment that is less than 5 millimeters in length. The problem with all of these little bits of plastic is that they can take hundreds of years to decompose. More problematic is that microplastics continue to accumulate in the environment. Of course, this accumulation is thought to have a negative impact on environmental and human health, and to that, new studies, finer testing, and tighter regulations are underway. Recently, to protect its drinking water supplies, the state of California announced its intention to require microplastics testing. What will that involve? How will it be implemented? What challenges will water and environmental laboratories face? To help us learn more about California's legislation, we met with Dr. Scott Coffin, a research scientist at the California State Water Resources Control Board. And now, here is our host from Perkin-Elmer, John Martin.
We are joined today by Dr. Scott Coffin, a research scientist in the Division of Drinking Water of the California State Water Resources Control Board, who is researching and developing regulations for microplastics for the state of California. Welcome, Dr. Coffin. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule today to join us.
Happy to talk with you today, John.
Before we delve into the specific topic of microplastics, could you tell us a little bit about the California State Water Resources Control Board and its work?
So the California State Water Resources Control Board, also known as the State Water Board, is one of 6 boards, departments, and organizations of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and it has regulatory authority over drinking water, as well as implementing the Clean Water Act. And so what that means is we set our own drinking water standards here in California that are as stringent or more strict than the United States EPA. We can also require monitoring for discharge from wastewater treatment plants, as well as what goes into our drinking water.
And how did you and the state board become involved in the issue of microplastics, specifically in drinking water?
So microplastics, although scientists have been documenting microplastics in water for decades, there's not been a regulatory requirement for monitoring up until the passage of Senate Bill 1422. Which the California legislature passed in 2018. And this specifically requires the State Water Board to develop monitoring requirements and standardize methodologies for testing microplastics by this year. This will be the first state in the United States to perform any monitoring for microplastics in drinking water. And actually, this will be the first state government or government in general in the world to ever perform any monitoring for microplastics in drinking water.
And just if you could give us a little bit of background, why should we be concerned about microplastics in our drinking water?
So what we do know about microplastics is that it occurs virtually everywhere. It seems that everywhere that scientists have looked for it, they've found it basically from the deepest part of the ocean all the way to the tallest mountain. And it occurs in 94% of samples, drinking water samples tested in the United States. While we know that we're being exposed on a daily basis, we don't yet know how toxic this is to our health. And this is something that we are actively investing research in and trying to determine what this really means for us. Before we get a good understanding, or while we're trying to get a good understanding of the human health effects, we can get a better understanding of our exposure. So once we have an idea of the exposure and the hazards, then we can assess the risks and mitigate those risks if they are excessive.
So is the initial study, the initial monitoring that you're doing to establish this baseline in the drinking water?
Absolutely. The monitoring that we'll be performing in California will be largely exploratory. Since no government agency has ever required monitoring for microplastics in water before, this will be a largely groundbreaking effort in which we'll be laying the foundation for how standardized methodologies are performed, how data is cleaned up and accessed and sent to a database. Um, all of the absolute basic things that needs to be developed in order for a monitoring program to work, in addition to trying to get a handle on what levels of contamination we're finding in the source waters. Most of California gets their water from surface water, from lakes and streams and reservoirs, as well as the State Water Project, which transports water from Northern California to Southern California. And this water is influenced by many different factors in which microplastics may make its way into those source waters. Aerial deposition, discharge from wastewater treatment plants, stormwater effluent, just to name a few. And we're anticipating that these source waters are going to have varying levels of contamination. And since no one has ever monitored before in a comprehensive way in California, the first step is just to figure out what could potentially make it into our drinking water supplies. Then, once we find contamination, we will look in the treated drinking water to determine if it's actually being removed before it's being sent to people's homes.
How long is this study going to last? It sounds like a pretty comprehensive of effort.
Right now, we're planning for 4 years of monitoring and reporting, and we're splitting it into two phases. The first phase, which will last approximately 2 years, will be largely testing out these methods and getting laboratories and water systems acquainted and up to speed on the best practices and looking for microplastics in those source waters. Once we get an understanding for where we're finding contamination, we'll go back to the water systems that have contamination and look in the treated drinking water and try and figure out really how much we're being exposed to.
Are there existing methodologies that you can draw upon to do this testing, or will you be developing methodologies as you do this work?
We've developed a number of methods in order to be able to perform this work. Over the past 2 years, we've been working with 40 laboratories from 7 different countries through an interlaboratory method validation project. This was facilitated by a close government partner, which is the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, also known as SQUIRP. And what SQUIRP did is they they developed a sample that had known quantities and types of microplastics as well as false positives. And they sent this sample out to each of the participating laboratories and asked them to run one of a number of standard operating protocols depending on the instrumentation they had in their laboratory. So the methods that we tested out included Raman and infrared spectroscopy, pyrolysis, gas chromatography with mass spectrometry, and a couple of other more novel methods. Most of the laboratories performed Raman or infrared, and we only had 2 laboratories that had the pyrolysis GCMS. Based on this method performance data, we're able to parse out the factors that make getting good results possible and determined that an average laboratory is capable of performing quite well with Raman and infrared with certain limitations. And those are mostly dependent on the size of the particles and the types of the particles, with fibers being much more challenging to enumerate than the other types of particle morphologies.
Now, you had mentioned obviously the two different phases of the project. But ultimately, after you quantify the risk, the amount of microplastics that are in the water samples, developing or implementing technologies, methodologies for removing these contaminants of a concern from drinking water. I wonder, are there methodologies that exist today that could do that, or are you going to have to look into developing new technologies for the filtering, the cleaning of the drinking water as well?
We're aware of a number of treatment techniques that are commonly used that are effective at removing microplastics. And the efficacy really depends on the size of the particles. So for instance, most treatment plants that have surface water as their source waters are doing some type of particle removal anyway. This typically involves sand filtration or sedimentation and flocculation, and those methods are great at removing the larger microplastics down to about 10 micrometers or so. When you get below the micron level into the nanoscale, that's when things get very challenging to remove, even with these traditional techniques. There, we can look to other technologies that are typically used in treatment plants that have higher levels of other contaminants. Reverse osmosis is seems to be the best technology for removing microplastics all the way down to very small nano-sized particles. But there's also other filtration cartridges that can be used. Ultrafiltration, microfiltration. These are all sized-based technologies that prevent particles of certain sizes from passing through. And many treatment plants in Southern California are already using these types of technologies as they have other existing contaminants that they're trying to remove. And in some cases, when we find it may be possible that in some cases, when we find microplastics above concerning levels in drinking water supplies, certain systems may decide that upgrading their treatment process would not only be good to remove the microplastics, but also other contaminants that they're already concerned about. So there's definitely going to be co-benefits with a lot of these technologies, and it's unlikely that we're going to need to develop a treatment technique specifically for microplastics.
Now, you had also mentioned that these microplastics are everywhere. Studies have found them to be on the tops of mountains and in a lot of different um, water supply sources, surface water, etc. Are there actions that we could take to remove or eliminate those plastics as something of a concern before they even got to the treatment plant stage? What can we do as a society, as a communities, to fight back or eliminate microplastics as a concern?
The main sources of microplastics in our environment are from our packaging and our clothing, as well as our tires. Those are really the three main contributors. We have a lot of control over our packaging. This is something that we are taking a comprehensive step towards addressing, not only here in California, but also at an international level. Just last week, the United Nations Environment Assembly agreed on treaty language to developing a binding international treaty to limit the amount of plastic waste that enters our environment. And this is a very inspiring thing to see for countries to come together and agree that there should be some limits on plastic, like there are limits on greenhouse gas emissions to reduce climate change. Here in California, we are developing a comprehensive policy plan in collaboration with the Ocean Protection Council over the next 4 years, in which we'll be using science as well as what we already know about plastic and how it gets into the environment to develop strategies or policy strategies to communicate to the legislature in order to reduce the amount of plastic that gets into our environment. The fibers and the tire wear particles, these two are very challenging to prevent from getting into our environment. We're going to be able, or we're going to need to consider different strategies than just controlling the packaging particles that make it into our environment. So, for instance, it seems like washing machine filters is one of the best methods for reducing the fiber discharge from our synthetic clothing. And this is something that a consumer can purchase and put onto their washing machine retroactively. There are also a number of bills in California, as well as other states right now, that would require new washing machines to have filters installed on them to remove microfibers. And for tire wear particles, this one might actually be one of the trickiest types of microplastic to reduce, as it seems like all tires tend to break down and produce these particles. In order to capture those from entering our waterways, we can look to existing infrastructure design that reduces contaminants from entering water already. This includes green stormwater, green infrastructure, low impact design. You might have seen these around rivers and just around your environment. They often look like patches of plants next to a waterway or next to a storm drain. They're actually quite pleasing to the eye, and they green up the space. They're great for removing tire wear particles from entering the water, but they're also good at removing other contaminants. So this is one of the ways, and also thinking about redesigning our transportation infrastructure. California has many incentives to reduce the amount of cars on the road beyond just tire wear particles and microplastics. We can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by investing in public infrastructure, public transportation. That'll also reduce the amount of air pollution that we produce. So there's a lot of the impacts of microplastics are a symptom of other environmental issues, and so addressing one of those issues will often have co-benefits.
Oh, fantastic. One last question before we let you go. What's next in your work and your research in the activities for the California State Water Resources Control Board? What's the next step in your work with microplastics and the investigations that you have ongoing?
So right now we are focused heavily on drinking water, as we have an imminent legislative deadline to monitor and report that to consumers. But we are also focused heavily on what's going on in the marine environment. And currently we are assessing risks of microplastics to San Francisco Bay. There was a recent study done from the San Francisco Estuary Institute that looked at microplastics in different parts of the bay and the fish and the sediment. And we have just developed a risk assessment framework to be able to use that information and determine if the bay is impaired or not. This will be the first ecological risk assessment that's been performed by a government for microplastics. And this will really lay the foundation for further research, and as well as determine the type of monitoring that we're going to need to do moving forward to protect our marine ecosystems.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Coffin. Thank you for giving us some insight into this very important work that you're doing. We are looking forward to seeing the results come out and seeing some beneficial actions and steps being made to combat microplastics in the environment. It's been wonderful talking to you, and we also thank you, the viewers, as well, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again on another edition of Envirochat.